Hello and welcome to Libero, the podcast about the most important of the least important things, as Arrigo Sacchi once said. Now, we're going to start with our normal request. We really enjoy doing this podcast and we hope that you all like listening to it as well. But if you really want to help us, please give us a hand. You can follow us or you can subscribe to us. You could leave a review on Spotify or on Apple. You can get involved on social media. We are now on X, on Blue Sky, on Instagram now at LiberoPod. Please find our content, share it, comment on it, and so on. Also, don't be afraid to tell your friends about the Libero podcast. It might be whether you are picking them up from your children from nursery on Friday, going to the farmer's market on Saturday morning, going to the craft beer tap room on Saturday afternoon, or whatever you do with your weekends. We need your help getting the word out there. Now, my name's Jack Pitt-Brooke, I'm from The Athletic, and I'm joined on today's show by my athletic colleague James Horncastle, all the way from Ripon, and the Observer's Rory Smith from Boston Spa. Have I got that one right?
Not posh enough to live in Boston Spa.
No, sorry, I've just double-checked my research. It's Rory's from Burley and Wharfdale.
Nearly.
And James has come all the way from Wetherby.
Do you know who is from Burley and Wharfdale, Jack? Harry Brooke. England captain. Played cricket at our cricket club.
Amazing.
We're big on Harry Brooke. We've invested heavily in Harry Brooke.
When Rory says our cricket club, he means the cricket club his family has owned for generations.
We are dealing with true Yorkshire royalty on this show. But I want to get to something really important to me personally, and that is that the club season ended only a few days ago, but we're already getting into what I think is the best and most kind of meaningful part of the football season. And it's not the players' transfer market because that hasn't really got underway yet, but I feel like the real juice is here already. So far in the last week or so, we've had Damian Comolli leaving Toulouse to go to Juventus. We've had Victor Orta leaving Sevilla. We had the news last night that Dave Brailsford is stepping away from his role at Manchester United. Jason Wilcox is stepping up from technical director to be director of football. And I think best of all is the news that Domenico Tetti, formerly of Sampdoria, Apoel Nicosia and Al Shabab, is on his way to Wolverhampton Wanderers. James, this really is what it is all about.
It really is. I mean, this is the main event. We are halfway through. People don't realise this, but we're halfway through this mini transfer window, which has been put on for the Club World Cup, which is part of the show itself, surely. You know, there's no reason really to introduce this new window now, other than for there to be this meta market of, you know, the people who do transferring from one club to another. So, yeah, it's you know what we live for.
I like meta market.
Meta market, yeah.
Meta market is really good. Horncastle's done some prep.
Rory, can we date this at all? This because I mean, like Michael Edwards going back to Liverpool was a big thing. You know, cheeky out Viana in at City last year. Obviously, Andrea Berta going back to Arsenal was quite a big story. When did we get this interested in the revolving door of executive roles?
Well, so obviously, the director of football is still. I mean, it's established in England now, isn't it? But it's relatively new. It's a this century thing. Like there were no directors of football.
Oh, steady on.
Oh, really?
David Pleat was brought in by Alan Sugar. I think David Pleat was actually the first ever director of football in English football. He was brought in by Alan Sugar in 1998. Alan Sugar had seen that he had seen the success of the director of football model in Europe, but obviously this had never been a thing before. Sugar and former Ipswich chairman David Sheepshanks wrote a letter to the League Managers Association explaining the value of a director of football, and so Alan Sugar came in. But I think it kind of didn't really. You know, he clashed with George Graham, and my thinking about this is the director of football in the UK only really kicked in with Chelsea. You know, when they got Frank Arneson out of Tottenham in 2005. So I think that would have been the first time a team won the Premier League with a director of football.
But you had James's great friend Franco Baldini at Tottenham as well, which presumably it comes after that. Chelsea, is Arneson the first, or was there P.F. Lisser?
But here,
yeah,
I think it's quite interesting here because we just keep mentioning Tottenham, like Tottenham.
Welcome to my life, James.
Yeah. No, I think Tottenham are fundamental in this story, at least in a UK context, because before that you had the manager all'inglese, the totalizing figure of the English manager who would not just coach the team but would do everything, including recruitment. And then a little bit later, that story was upgraded to, they had a great relationship with the chief executive. So that would be Sir Alex Ferguson and David Gill. It would be Arsene Wenger and David Dean. But Spurs were the one that really kind of went after this model. I didn't think of David Pleat as their first sporting director, Jack, and Alan Sugar kind of holding some sort of apprentice style.
He's a visionary.
Yeah, exactly.
No, but this is the thing. Spurs genuinely. This is like tangential, but like Spurs genuinely have got this mad role in English football where they kind of saw everything coming first. They just did it wrong. So they hire, and we'll come on to this later on, but they hire not only Michael Edwards works for Spurs, but Ian Graham works for Spurs as a consultant through a company that a guy called Henry Stott ran, whose name I've forgotten the name of the company now. But they bring in this kind of data consultancy. Spurs should have been the Moneyball club. They just never quite. I think the basic problem was they hired Ian Graham as a consultant effectively, and then they hired Harry Redknapp. And I don't know how much you know about Harry Redknapp, Jack, but he's not the sort of man who was prepared to listen to a load of nerds. So it's not, in a way, it's not surprising that Spurs spotted the benefit of it. James, I don't know if you know anything particularly about any football in European countries, but I don't know if there's a country you're an expert in some way. How far back does it go in Italy?
So, Jack was saying this is a more or less this century phenomenon, give or take, 2 years.
Come on, you pedant.
In Italy, this goes back to the very start, the beginning of time of Italian football. The fact that you would have a general manager or club secretary who does all of the transfers, was absolutely fundamental to the running of a football club. The coach in Italy, if you want to translate literally what their role is, it's allenatore, which is trainer. He's not a manager. He's there to train the team. Everybody else at the club has specific roles. And I think Juventus in particular, I wouldn't say they pioneered this, but they, because of the Fiat empire, you would have, Fiat have factories in Sweden, in Argentina. They would have, they even obfuscated the kind of Cold War by opening sort of factory in the Soviet Union. And they would have people in lots of different places, and they would just, send an executive to essentially do the sporting director's role, or, say, our Fiat manager in Buenos Aires, he's been going to games. There's this guy, Omar Sivori, we should go and sign him. Whereas I always felt that for the English football man, their transfers were kind of, limited to, the AA roadmap and various kind of service stations, around the UK. Whereas already in Italy, you had this kind of global perspective.
Is that related to Italy's famed love of bureaucracy, or is it? I don't know if either of you listen to Finn versus History, the controversial podcast, or are familiar with the concept of the umarell. Do you know what that is, James?
No.
So the umarell is an Italian thing. It's an old man who stands on building sites and tells people what they're doing wrong.
Okay. sounds like Sicilian dialect, that is. But
it may well be. Yeah, it's definitely it will be or it could be Neapolitan. Yeah, it's definitely a form of dialect. But so they have this whole job for like an old guy, and his job is just like to point at people and say, "This is what you should be doing." Is that what is that the route of the director of football? It was a guy who stood behind the manager going, "Well, you should do this."
Well, look, I mean, there is just like so much lore around this figure in Italy. You can almost plot this kind of family tree, if you like, of great influential executives. I think the great Brian Glanville, who kind of passed away, one of the investigations that he did was into a guy called Italo Allori, who was kind of very successful general manager at Juventus, at Napoli, and was seen as this kind of prototypical sort of Luciano Moggi, Adriano Galliani, Beppe Marotta at the moment kind of figure. In terms of what you were saying there about bureaucracy, Rory, yeah, this guy isn't someone in certainly Italian context who is there just simply to recruit. He's there to network and influence decisions that touch on all aspects of the running of a football club. So, that can be, why are we playing on a Saturday instead of a Sunday? I mean, that's quite a modern phenomenon because all games would be on a Sunday traditionally in Italy. Or, can we maybe lobby so we have 3 foreign players that we can sign instead of 2 foreign players? Or, there are lots of things that have gone into this role.
Can I acquire some prostitutes for this referee? That sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that has been kind of central to how a football club is run in Italy since not even before the 1920s. I mean, these figures come to prominence because of some scandals, and there have been scandals since the very beginning in Italy, and there have been sort of general managers or sporting directors or whatever you want to call them, kind of at the heart of them. We're not saying that all sporting directors are, corrupt or anything like that. We're just saying that, they've often been, this role has come to the forefront in many Italian stories, since the turn of the 20th century.
Do we know if, I mean, I genuinely don't know the answer to this question, but do we know, was it as significant a role in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, in the sort of second half of the 20th century before it caught on in the UK?
So I think the German thing is quite interesting, is that James mentioned like Galliani and Monchi, and they weren't sporting directors in the sense that we think of them. They were business executives. That's what they had a post within the club. Germany, because of the model, the famed 50+1 model, I think you have a lot of people. It's the side of 50+1 that I find really interesting. That we kind of hold it up in this country as this kind of perfect ideal of what a football club should be in the modern era. Because it's not, there's no money from states, there's none of this stuff. But if you look at a lot of the big city clubs, Cologne and Hamburg in particular, 50+1's terrible for them because you get all these like political, like lobbying behind the scenes, these like interest groups that want control of the big local institution. And I think it probably comes out because you have kind of fan control effectively, and then you also have a lot of people who want to work in the club, who want to say, well, I want to imprint this vision on the club. And I suspect that's where it comes from in Germany. I think in France, I don't know in France, I can't think of any sort of significant figures in French football who occupied that role particularly, but I might be wrong. And in Holland, I think, again, you have a lot of, like at Ajax and Feyenoord and stuff, you've got a lot of kind of civic interest in the team. And also these big visionaries, Dutch people famously will just tell you what they think all the time. So I wonder if that's a legacy of Cruyff, that you have this overarching vision of what this club should be in Holland. Spain, not sure.
But do you think that the growth of, because now, like, obviously every, like, European football now is so homogenous, right, that to a large extent, like most clubs anywhere, like an elite club anywhere in Europe will largely look similar. Like, it might be on a different scale, it might have more money, but they generally operate a similar way. And if you think about the rise of, if we're going to say, I think we are that the sort of end of the 20th century, start of the 21st century is characterised by the rise of the director of football model, or that was a big part of it. Would you describe this as being something which started in Italy and then kind of spread out in the way that, people would often want, like in the same way that people would often go for Italian coaches, would they go for the Italian director of football model? Is it an Italian thing which has been kind of picked up by other countries, or do you think this developed in a different way from that?
I think, look, Italy stopped exporting great players, a while ago, in terms of that kind of 80s, 90s generation. There's still very good players who come to the Premier League. Your Tonalis, your Chiesas, your Calafioris, and that sort of thing. But where Italy really prides itself has been on exporting coaches and still producing great coaches, but also exporting kind of executives as well. It's something that they're really proud of. Although from my experience, it's something that also, sort of new owners, let's say American owners, are always quite reticent about. They're like, oh, Italy, do we really want to get involved in that? The talent pool there is shallow when, I think it's actually sort of very deep. I think in terms of like, is it something that's kind of spread out from Italy? Again, my knowledge is relatively superficial of these other countries. Where I think there was something that's kind of become truly transformational is we tend to think about football clubs. We simplify how we identify them in terms of Sir Alex Ferguson's Man United, Wenger's Arsenal. You wouldn't associate Sevilla with anybody other than Monchi. It's Monchi's Sevilla, and despite them having sort of various different coaches, Lopetegui and so on, who've won the Europa League for them, those successes were always associated with Monchi and brand Monchi. I think he, for all we've spoken about the Italian legacy in this, no one kind of made this more appealing or sexy or had the bigger brand than Monchi in terms of saying, yeah, this is how we recruit. Let me open up our doors and tell you that, we'll have all of these different markets and we'll have, sort of 5 targets per position, from Argentina and all this sort of thing. And the cult of Monchi was sort of very powerful indeed, to the point where I think a lot of clubs, particularly I'm going to use this word, since the financialization of football.
Ding, 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 ding. Ring the bell.
Since
we should have a Miguel-themed bell. We should have a bell that just goes, "This is bullshit."
Oh, really? So since the big clubs seem to get even further and further away from the rest, the importance of having a sporting director who could help you punch above your weight, not only in making the team competitive, but also this additional revenue stream, which is, if everyone gets the Deloitte Money League, and their pie charts are kind of split into 3: match day revenue, commercial revenue, and TV revenue. The big differential, it feels, over the last 15, 20 years has become player trading revenue. And, I think that kind of, the focus on that starts with Monchi, the kind of buying low, selling high.
Sorry, Jack, I'm just going to very quickly, I promise. I think that's absolutely right. I suspect that there's an element of best practice just spreading, which football does really well. Like it's probably something you should say almost admiringly about football. Like if someone has a good idea, it gets picked up straight away. And you see it with set piece coaches or throwing coaches, whatever it might be. Like best practice spreads. I think that's a part of it. And the other thing is, I wonder whether the change in ownership is relevant too. That American groups tend to need like a person on the ground to do it. They realise pretty quickly there is a network that they're not immediately part of, and they tend to look for someone who can tap into that. Thinking about the German side of it, that their profile of sporting directors has changed a lot from like a Carly Rummenigge or a Rudi Voller, who kind of did that role almost as like the Umarell, like they were the guy standing behind the guy saying, "Why don't you do this?" To these like really sleek, young, like uber trendy, very German figures, people like Simon Rolfers at Leverkusen, Jonas Bolt, who was at Leverkusen.
Yeah,
a lot of roll necks, a lot of nice glasses. They're young. And I wonder to an extent whether that is to protect the sporting side of the club from the political side of the club. I think that is a part of it as well, that you need someone who stands in between those two elements of a fan-owned, fan-run club. And that maybe applies to Barca as well. There is one team that doesn't really have a sporting director, and that's Real Madrid. Juni Calafat is their kind of chief scout, and he's brilliant at it. He knows that if you can sign a Brazilian, you sign a Brazilian. But I don't know if they have anyone. Am I wrong? Do Real have anyone in that role? I don't think there is someone there.
No, I think Madrid is Madrid, and so they know that they can attract the very best players, regardless of who is sporting director or not, whether they have one or not.
Is it Jose Angel Sanchez? Does he kind of do that for Florentino.
Yeah.
General manager.
Yeah, it's a more traditional kind of form of. He's like a Galliani figure, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but you mentioned Califat. You know, their scouting is certainly in Brazil has been very effective, be it with Vinicius and Rodrigo, because I like to think I know stuff about football, but I hadn't heard of any of those guys. And their development has been, they were not stars when they joined Real Madrid. So that is, I think that's something that why, Jack, people are fascinated in this role of the sporting director, because just as people live vicariously through footballers, a lot of people who follow football had the dream of becoming footballers themselves. When that dream kind of is shattered and you have to come to the realization that I'm never going to make it, people still think, well, I know a player. I can.
Yeah. Well, I want to get onto this issue of to what extent these guys are talent spotters later, because to me that's one of the most interesting things. I'm pleased that Rory mentioned the distinctive look of the sporting director. I think that sporting directors as a class have a real kind of Davos energy, like expensive suit, expensive watch, always a lanyard, multilingual, possessing probably at least 2, maybe 3 mobile phones, always on the phone, not averse to a Bluetooth earpiece. Slightly kind of TED Talk energy. You would back, I think a lot of these guys, I would back them to deliver a punchy TED Talk in about 4 different languages. And that, I mean, to me, that is the essence of the modern sporting director. But I think, I just want to pick up on two quick things that I think were really important. The first is that I think that the Rory's talking about the spread of best practice. And I really think that when we talk about the Premier, like what has made the Premier League so successful in the last sort of 30 years, I think what it really comes down to more than anything else is openness to everything that they can find from foreign football and frankly other foreign countries. It's almost like going in with a site with, even though it was built on this like English football heritage, the openness to foreign managers, foreign fans, foreign owners, foreign players, foreign money, and foreign ways of doing things, including the director of football model, I think has been really the sort of super strength of the Premier League and allowed it to be this product. So, like traditionally, we always look at those other aspects as being, first it was the foreign players who came in, and then it was the foreign managers, and then it was the foreign owners, and then it was the foreign fans. But we're kind of missing in there that like foreign management structures were a big part of that. And now all Premier League clubs are almost to every single one is run differently than it was before. But the other point that really kind of accelerated that process is the US. Like you talk to any fan of any US team, of any US sports team, will talk a lot about their team's front office. Yeah. Like it really matters as much who is, in those kind of executive recruitment analytical roles as it does who is in the dugout. And obviously, if you've owned a US sports team and you come into English football, you're going to want like a really reputable, robust, high-paid front office. You're not going to just say, "Oh, the manager does the signings. He'll call some of his mates and they'll do it." So I think that I'm sure that and I think particularly if you look at like Rory, you'll know about the early days of FSG, which really, where people really used to take the piss.
Yeah.
When FSG started with Commonly, who we mentioned at the top of the show, and so on. But now, like FSG have clearly been ahead of the curve, right?
Well, yeah. There's that famous Neil Ashton piece, isn't there, from like 2014? I think in the Sun, maybe the Mail, about the laptop wielding gurus in air conditioned rooms who were kind of destroying Brendan Rodgers' project at Liverpool.
I can't believe they signed him Roberto Firmino. What are they doing?
I know, what a nonsense. And that's only 10 years ago. Like, if you think about that would have been a completely valid stance to take 10 years ago. There was still quite kind of a groundswell of resistance to why don't you let the manager have control? The manager should be the central figure that, as Horny says, like the manager and Alan Glazer, that traditional like Ferguson totemic figure. You don't actually hear that argument advance very often anymore. Like I can't think of the last time I heard someone say you should give the manager more control. Like with Arteta, at Arsenal, when Edu left for Forest or the Marinakis group or whatever, Arsenal fans were a bit like, hang on, is this not a bit much? Is there not, like, I think football fans now have kind of internalised this idea that there should be a separation of powers. Like, you have the manager who does the coaching and the training and obviously has input into these things, but you want a team of people who is looking after recruitment. And the one thing I would say, I spoke to Ian Graham the other day, and I don't think it's breaking like any confidence is to say this, but this stuff matters. It's important, because if you want to change your team, especially in the Premier League, but everywhere really, James has touched on kind of the financial importance for teams like Sevilla of being able to generate a profit from player trading. But if you want to make a manifest difference to either your team or your club, the way you do that is recruitment. So Ian's running a company now called Ludonautics, who are got various clients around football, and the first thing that people go to them for is, we want your help with recruitment. We want to know we're spending our money the right way. So I think these figures, that kind of front office concept, is maybe a belated realization that it's a specialist skill, and it's something. I don't buy the idea that the manager doesn't have time to do it. I think that's bollocks, to be honest. I don't think managing a football team involves like a ridiculous amount of work that's planning training sessions doesn't take that long. I think they probably could do it if they have more time to dedicate to the training sessions. Good, that's good for them. But this, we've all written pieces about how the manager, this manager's so like hardworking. He gets he's at his desk by 9:05, and he sometimes doesn't leave until 4:30.
Sometimes the sun goes down, he's still at his desk, and he has to turn the lights on.
It's an awful business. And do you remember Graham Westley, who was he managed like Stevenage and teams like that? And Wesley was famous. He was this famous sort of tyrant because he made his players do a full working day. And you're like, come on, this is like he's there from 9 till 5. This is awful. But no, so I think it is genuinely important. Like recruitment, I think to an extent the director of football is a fashion thing. I think that's definitely true. And I think it speaks volumes about the way that we cover football and the way that we think about football and what interests us about football. And I think the celebrity that they've kind of attached or has been attached to them in recent years is nonsensical, but it is genuinely important. Like recruitment does really matter.
I think we'd all be in agreement that good recruitment is completely integral and to any club, and clubs to a large extent stand or fall by the quality of their recruitment. Like Liverpool have not spent a ridiculous amount of money really during the FSG era, but in the main they've bought so well. Salah, Firmino, Fabinho, Van Dijk, Alisson, like they've bought so well that they've been an unbelievably consistently good team. Like this is incredibly obvious. Manchester United spent a huge amount of money on bad players. They are now a bad team. Like nobody would dispute that. I guess what I'm interested in, and I think this is where what we want to tease apart this term a bit, is to what extent are these directors of football, particularly the kind of big name, flashy, Davosy ones, to what extent are they talent spotters? Because there's a bit of like a mythos attached to a lot of sporting directors, which you hear these stories about them. He flew to Lima, he drove for 10 hours, he went to an under-11s game, he watched for 2 minutes, came away and said, that's our boy, went all the way back, and then he's got in touch with the family, and then 10 years later sold the player for 100 million. And like people obviously want to cultivate this sense that like whether it's Monchi or whoever else is just a genius talent spotter who can like see innate things in young players or in players playing step 6 football or whatever in the Wessex League, and they can just tell that these players are going to be great. But I don't really think that's true, really. Like I think the more you learn about particularly a lot of these directors of football, what really distinguishes them in their job is not talent spotting, because they don't really do that. Like they might have a team of scouts underneath them who go and watch the players. Really, it's their proximity to agents. Genuinely, how many phone calls a day do they have with Jorge Mendes, to pick a name at random?
Completely at random. How
good are they at trading favours and negotiating? Do they learn the first if a player comes onto the market? Are they in constant 24/7 WhatsApp contact with the relevant stakeholders? So I just wonder whether we need to, and I think a lot of the big name sporting directors really stand or fall by it's almost like relationship management, stakeholder management, rather than going to go and watch Keto under 12s.
Well, I think it's a combination of all these things. At least it should be for the very best. And some of the highest profile sporting directors or managing director of football or chief football officer, they have so many titles these days, I kind of lose count. But like, I mean, some, like Victor Orta, for example, was a journalist who...
We don't know anything about football.
No.
Well, yeah. So, and Leeds fans would say the same about Victor on the back of their relegation a few years ago. But look, I think with my experience dealing with some of these individuals is a lot of them started out as scouts and did exactly what Jack was saying. They go to the sub-20 tournament in South America. They've got incredible stories about going into some, really dodgy barrio in Argentina to speak to the kind of families of the players. All of these things. And then they kind of graduate into being sporting directors. I think what I was meaning about they have to have all of these things is that if you go to these tournaments in the middle of nowhere, that's where you'll often meet agents for the first time. And human relationships, I think, are still the main thing that matters in all of this, because you can have an algorithm, for example, that flags up players and filters players specific to what your team and what your manager needs or whatever. But you then do have to go out and speak to the family, see what their background is, get an understanding of where they're from, what their kind of cultural context is. That is a lot of work, which is, it's actually very difficult to do from a laptop in those air-conditioned rooms that that Ashton kind of wrote about. So you need this kind of blend. What surprised me, having sort of made contacts with people who were scouts who then became sporting directors, so scouts who would travel all the time, is that all of a sudden when they become sporting directors, they're just at the training ground all the time, or they're at the stadium watching their team all the time, or they might be sat in the dugout with the manager all the time. And I think the way we've been brought up to think of these, it's like these guys should be out and about. They shouldn't be at their own training ground or at their own games. They should be watching other teams play to find out their plays. And instead, a big part of this job is having that daily dialogue with the manager to understand what he needs and wants, being around the dressing room to see what personalities fit, what don't, and what is good for their environment, and then kind of filtering that down to your scouts. That's something that I think we often kind of underplay, or I initially thought, looking at some of these celebrity sporting directors, this is lazy. What are you doing? You should be back in Lima. You should be back in Quito. And but I think the human aspect is still really important. I was on a panel with Cesc Fabregas yesterday, and I asked him about Como's use of data, because they have brought in consultancies, people who've worked for data analytics firms in the past. And he said, it's really useful. You can flag a left back to me, which has got all the criteria I want, but I need to see how that left back reacts in the 5 minutes after he's made a mistake, and whether all of a sudden his head drops, he stops playing, and those kind of things that aren't picked up by data. And okay, that's Cesc Fabregas saying that. He's a coach. But I think that's also something that these sporting directors look for that isn't picked up in a kind of Opta stats pack.
I think that there is more skill. They're famous for a reason. Like, I don't think that they are, we should pretend in any way that they're kind of irrelevant, that they have generally risen through either that scouting route or through a kind of club management route. And the best ones, I think, do add a huge amount to, they are vital, because you do have this football, as it becomes much more knee-jerk, you do need someone there to say, actually, this is kind of what we need to think about. We've got this 17-year-old in the under-18s who we think has got this pathway to be a first-team player. So we need to make sure that our strategy is not... It kind of takes that into account, effectively. So that, the manager might want a left-back now, but we know that this kid's going to come through in 3 years, so we need to make sure that can happen. You need that kind of overall vision. And clubs, I think, when you have that talismanic manager model, that doesn't really happen as everything becomes about the now. So I think they are providers of efficiencies in a way, which is not a very sexy thing to say. I think the talent spotting element, you could maybe the more kind of sympathetic view is that it's changed a lot. I remember speaking to Jonas Bolt, who had worked at certainly Leverkusen and then Hamburg and maybe somewhere else as well. And he basically got his break because he was living in Argentina, a German living in Argentina, and he went to like a South American under-20 competition, and he was the only representative of a club who was there. There was no other European club there, and he spotted someone like Zé Roberto, someone of that kind of ilk, who ended up signing for Leverkusen. They thought, right, this guy's clearly a talent. You know, he's got an eye for talent. Did he have an eye for talent that's different to anybody else? I'm not sure. Like, I think he was in a place where he was able to see a player who was obviously very good, and then presumably meet the agent, meet the family, do a lot of the groundwork. He spoke languages, so that enabled him to kind of get it over the line. That's all changed now. I suspect if you go to the South American Under-17 Championship, there's loads of sporting directors and there's loads of agents and there's loads of scouts. Like, football doesn't have those blind spots anymore in nearly the same way. So now I suspect it is much more about managing a team of scouts who can do it for you, selecting those scouts as you think they're good, and having kind of systems in place. I remember talked to Monchi once, and he had a guy whose job it was basically to do background checks on all the players, to go and be like, right, what's wrong? This guy looks like a good footballer. Is he a womanizer? Is he a drinker? Is he a disruptive influence in the dressing room? You know, what's his family situation like? What's his kind of, as Horny says, like, what's his background? They take all of that into account, and I think the sporting director's job, that director of football job, is basically to manage all of those processes that are in place. And it's just that football doesn't like processes because they're boring.
Yeah,
so
football certainly does not like processes, or it's had to really accept the validity of processes through a very painful process of realization.
And that's us as poncy broadsheet journalists, effectively saying that. Like that you can talk about the Athletic will do 3,500 words on some processes. Like the Observer or the New York Times or wherever will write that stuff because we are the wanky podcast for smudge snobs, and that's fine. That's our USP. It's not a problem. But you can't get processes. I'm not being funny. You're not getting processes in the sun. You're just not.
You know, I'm not. I think this job is actually quite similar to the job that we do. We're not there to select players and that sort of thing, but a sporting director's job is ultimately to find the signal amid the noise. You know, it's you know, we will get told lots of things about one particular story, and you have to ascertain who is credible in what they're saying to you. And I think that's true of footballers as well, who are prospective targets for clubs, because the agent will always be telling you, this guy is perfect for you. He's amazing. He's exactly what you need. And you can't just rely on that voice. You have to talk around the player. You have to talk to people at his previous club, teammates, and that sort of thing. And that is a major part of the job. As you know, I think, Jack, you were alluding to this at the top of this section, being tapped in with all the agents who matter, you know, sort of being part of that, you know, knowing who is available, what's available, you know, that being part of that network is very valuable. It's not enough just to be a no-name sporting director at a big club. You have to be known, you know.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have to have agents introduce you to other agents, and that leaves you looking, I think, quite vulnerable.
But also, it's having that network established in the places that you need it. So I did a story ages on Moises Caicedo and how he ended up at Brighton, because everybody wanted Caicedo, but there was this really confused agency situation where I think like 9 different people. He's got a really big family, and different bits of his family had given different mandates to different agents. So he was at Independiente del Valle, which, and this is a, you know, very much an on-brand thing to say, Jack. It's a very interesting club doing some interesting things, and they're a really good. They're basically like a European club in South America. They're run in a way that's much more streamlined than most South American clubs are. I think that's fair to say. And the club were willing to do a deal, but they were like, you've got to work out. Like the test was basically, can you work out which agent actually represents him? And the reason he went to Brighton is just Dan Ashworth knew an agent in, I think, Colombia, who he had a really good relationship with, and he basically tasked that agent with picking his way through to the actual legally binding mandate.
Right,
And that was how
interesting.
Brighton got it over and done with. So, got it over the line, and that is part of sporting directorship. This is a big, complicated world, and you have to know the person to go to.
That's interesting because I came into this thinking whether the kind of what you might call the sort of transfer market fixer model was being a bit supplanted by the kind of data whiz model. Like people, Michael Edwards, I guess, being the ultimate example in the English-speaking world of the sort of data. I know his title technically isn't sporting director, but somebody who oversees that stuff, coming from a very, very analytical background. Like I know, and so I wondered whether the kind of the guy who knows all the agents, having that as the model might be almost a little bit old hat. I had a conversation recently with somebody in the analytics world who was saying to me that they were actually that they were a little bit surprised that Arsenal went for Berta as the new, because Berta is obviously coming ex-Atletico Madrid, incredibly well connected, really knows his way around the transfer market. But they were wondering whether Arsenal might have gone in a more analytical process-led direction rather than for a kind of master of the transfer market. But I was thinking, well, maybe teams would want to look at what Liverpool have done and go in a more Edwardsy direction. Do you think that's plausible, Rory, that teams might do that?
I think they will, because Liverpool and Brighton and Brentford, this will sound like bias, are kind of, they stand as best practice now. But I think you still need the deal maker. You need someone who can, and Michael Edwards does this for Liverpool. You need someone who can get those deals done, who knows the agents, who has the relationships with the clubs. If you look at what Liverpool are doing this summer, they've clearly got a good relationship with Bayer Leverkusen. I suspect dating back to talking about Xabi Alonso last year, and they have a kind of, you can imagine knowing Edwards a little bit and knowing Simon Rolfes a tiny bit. You can kind of imagine that they are people who would be able to do business together. I don't know if they're friends, but they seem like they're cut from a similar cloth almost. Certainly Richard Hughes and Simon Rolfes. James and I have both done television with Richard Hughes, and he's a very personable, kind of warm character.
I don't want to get too into boasting about TV work, so maybe we'll take a quick pause and then we'll come back with more recruitment chat after the break. So, Rory, you mentioned earlier Brighton as being like the ultimate best practice model, and this is, they are at the absolute cutting edge of data. Tony Bloom, Star Lizards, Jamestown Analytics, the hugely successful kind of data analysis operation has really allowed them. It's really allowed them to grow and grow and grow, and I think that the mistake that lots of clubs have made with Brighton in the last sort of 5-10 years is thinking they could just recruit individuals from Brighton and get some of that Brighton magic. But unless you bring the IP, that's not going to happen. And we've seen that with, whether it's players, managers, coaches, execs, whoever, going from Brighton to somewhere else, and kind of floundering a bit. Do you look at Brighton as being a model that other teams can follow, or is it so sort of specific because of the data that they have? Or what would you describe as being best practice for recruitment in 2025?
Brighton would be. It's really hard to quibble with the idea that Brighton and then Brentford will be interesting this year. Actually, I think if you think that they've already sold Flecken to Leverkusen and replaced him with Kelleher, but it looks like Mbuemo's going to Manchester United. Like Brentford, that's a challenge for them to see if they can repeat the trick. But Brighton and Brentford would be the two that I think most teams could learn from. But the problem that football has is quite often it tries just to this sounds pejorative, it's not meant to, steal it. Football still has this kind of great man theory of history that if you go and take the sporting director from Brighton, that not only will you have access to all of their knowledge, but you will in some way potentially maybe damage Brighton a little bit. Whereas what Brighton really teach you is that it's not about the people, it's the systems that are in place. They are all cogs in wheels. And even if you lose, I can't remember what Win Stanley and the other one who went to Chelsea, or David Weir or whatever, like they're not the people who kind of define that Brighton are good at recruitment. It's they're people who do a job within a system, and it's the system that matters. I think
it's the system and it's the IP. It's the data.
So data people would tell you that having the best data is what matters. I actually don't know if that's true, to be perfectly honest. I think the key thing is having good data and understanding it, and being able to apply that data to a defined style of play. So realizing that this metric is important for you and this metric actually isn't that important for you. And I mean, that's a really basic version. I've actually gone off data since I wrote a book about it. I decided that I was going to do a complete 180.
You're now a data Luddite.
I'm like a full-on
his book.
Anti-data. I'm an anti-data guy. I think we should all just be free. Just let them play. Stop giving them nutrition.
Let them play.
It's become too systematized.
I test all the way, baby.
Exactly. No. So I think what you need is you need good data and a clear idea of how it's implemented. That if you speak to people who operate within the data world, like Brighton's data might be better than Liverpool's. I don't really know what that would mean, but I think that both of those clubs and Brentford probably have a clearer idea of what they're looking for in the data and what the data can do for them, particularly in recruitment, which is how they all use it mainly, than Manchester United. I think that's the difference. They talk a lot about like clear communication, and like having buy-in is really important. So not having that sense of data. You know how managers, Jack, we've both written jokes about this before, but like that thing about banning ketchup. Like a new manager will always either ban or introduce condiments, and that's held up as the big like change. I think for a long time, and still at a lot of clubs, data is a form of ketchup. You will either get a manager in who will listen to it, and if that doesn't work, you'll get a manager in who doesn't.
You either put it on the table or you take it off the table.
Exactly.
But the interesting thing about that, to again stay on Brighton, is Roberto De Zerbi, for example. De Zerbi has a very clear idea of the players that work in his system and who he wants. I mean, De Zerbi is someone who watches lots and lots and lots of football, not just his own team, not just his own training sessions. And I think that was where, Brighton and De Zerbi had to kind of compromise, really, in terms of like, well, Roberto, this is how we do things. We've seen it be a success. And then Brighton looking at Roberto and saying, well, actually, damn, football's good. We're in Europe. And that's never happened before. With Brighton, I think as much as there is focus on Star Lizard and the data and that sort of thing, they are a club that believes in the eye test, believes in background checks, believe in kind of psychometrics and all that kind of stuff. And I think as much as lots of different people have been headhunted, and they are all competent people, don't get me wrong, but they have benefited from the halo effect of essentially working within that Brighton environment. They are a club that is owned by a fan, and someone who really deeply cares about the club. Likes to be in the away end when they were playing against Roma, for example, in the Europa League. And I actually do think this matters in terms of the culture that is within a club, the environment at a club. We always kind of joke about, does he know the club? Does he get the club? But I think it does matter. And two examples in Italy that relate to this point. One is Paolo Maldini. Paolo Maldini, technical director of AC Milan, who was sacked by the current owner, Redbird Capital. Paolo Maldini took that technical director job because it was almost a way of the owner who hired him then, Elliott. It gave them credibility. Wow, if Paolo Maldini's coming to work for them, these guys who are taking over must be credible. But Maldini had no experience of working in the transfer market, so initially kind of brought in Leonardo, then brought in Boban, then worked with this guy Ricky Massara. But ever since Maldini has been sacked, the kind of you could say that some of the soul of that club has gone. You know, that having a figure there who did negotiate, who would be the closer for signing like Teo Hernandez. We really want this player. He's been flagged up by our data, by our chief scout, Jeffrey Moncada. But in order to do it, Paulo, go meet him in Teo Hernandez, in Ibiza, be Paolo Maldini. And that being a massive kind of selling point for them. Paolo Maldini being at training, you know, for sort of signings. So it's like, well, we can't mess around here. Paolo's here. You know, the standards have got to be very high. Yeah, that's sort of another role that this kind of former player who knows the club, who comes into an executive role, that's what they kind of provide. And then there's another example of, you know, a very big name sporting director who did not have the career that Paolo had, working for a big Italian club. But how much of his job, again, was culture. So, yeah, first day, sitting down with the club secretary or sitting down with, you know, I'm going to mix Kath behind the reception desk, speaking to Kath for 3 hours because she knows everything that's gone on and you know, is in the club, and really kind of entwining yourself into the culture of the club so you understand it. And that sporting director was telling me that, you know, his successor, or one of his successors, you know, one of the reasons he's failed is because he hasn't done that. You know, he's walked in there, doesn't speak to anyone, just gets on with, you know, sort of signing players and speaking to agents, has done nothing to integrate himself into a club. And so he understands it. And I think, you know, that feel for a special chemistry or a special culture that there is in the club is still like really important. You can't put value on it. It's something that Man United is still struggling to engender.
Well, they're United are trying to find it, aren't they? They're trying to basically buy one in. I think it's interesting that you talk about people like Maldini, and you know, we started off talking about celebrity sporting directors, and there are some who I think maybe don't welcome it, but certainly don't discourage it. So like Luis Campos at PSG was on the pitch
in a very expensive pair of glasses. Before the Champions League final. Being on the pitch after it, not a problem at all. Like, you don't celebrate, everyone was there, not a problem. But before, it's a bit like you're kind of saying, all right, this is all to do with me. And Michael Edwards, who has a kind of mystique around him that I think is very rare in modern European football. It's just something I genuinely can't see Michael Edwards doing. I think he went on the pitch after Liverpool got the trophy after the game against Palace. I think he was there with Richard Hughes. He may not have been. I was there, and he was in the stands for a long, long time. Doesn't speak to the media at all. As far as I know, doesn't speak to anyone off the record, even. Just doesn't kind of have any truck with talking to journalists, which is fine. Probably a sign of good character, to be fair. And a lot of his stuff, a lot of his benefit, I think, is culture, and maybe not. I can't say whether yes or no to whether he does all that kind of culture, that organic culture building. I'm not sure. May not be his role anymore at Liverpool. But in terms of making sure that the data is embedded in the way that the club operates, in terms of streamlining those processes, Dan Ashworth did this at Brighton as well, and what he tried to do at Newcastle and tried to do at United. They see kind of making sure clubs run smoothly as their job, and I think that is really important. I think Michael Edwards is really, really good at what he does, and if you speak to people at Liverpool, I think after he left it was a bit of a mess, and now that he's back it's not. I think that's the main difference. The bit that I still fall down on, that maybe we need as a media to kind of to stop buying into, is this myth of them as having this unique gift for talent spotting, you know, going into deepest, darkest Argentina and rubbing someone's legs and saying they're going to be a great central defender. Like, that stuff I think is not true. That, I think, was the precise problem that Dan Ashworth had, right? Because he was a kind of top-down processes guy who'd been really good at it. And then but then he found himself in a situation, certainly at Newcastle and Manchester United, certainly from the outside, and maybe even from the inside, there was an expectation that he would tell you here are the 10 players you need to sign. It was.
They thought he was a Daily Mirror listicle in the summer. Do you know what I mean? Here are the 10 best players in Europe.
BuzzFeed.
And the 10 cheapest players in Europe. They thought Dan Ashworth was a listicle. And that was a real problem. Because Dan Ashworth doesn't do that sexy stuff. He's not. He will get you a deal done, like he did with Caicedo. Like, he knows agents and he's tapped in. He's got a network. But Dan Ashworth is going to talk to you a lot about your workplace culture, and that's not. I don't know about Newcastle, but that's not what United wanted. United wanted, like, we want our transfer guy. Who is the guy who can get these deals done? And it's because it's interesting. Maybe that's the big issue with Manchester United. Maybe they believe. Maybe there is no one at Manchester United currently who can tell them that the football industry doesn't function according to the vastly simplified version of the football industry that is presented to you in the media. Like, the great man theory of history does not apply. Like, all of this stuff is not based on individuals. It's about really boring systems and processes.
I'll make one sort of final point. We began this discussion about talking about meta markets. I mean, there is another thing going on here, which is a new thing, which is executive search, which again is like, when a new owner comes in, like, right, I want to, at Chelsea, for example, thank you, Marina, thank you, Bruce Buck, but we're going in a different direction here, and they use these executive search firms, which they've got high profiles in themselves. Maybe it's just something that we journalists talk about, and it hasn't kind of transcended, and sort of people think about, fans think about this. But like the idea of going to one of these big firms that are either sort of based in London or the US, and them coming up with the executive that is going to help lead your club, and make it successful. And don't get me wrong, I think that some of these executive search firms are good. Some of them, I think, have no idea of the actual cultural context of the club that they're asked to recruit for, which again comes back to my point about knowing your club.
But also, Horny, like, the reason so many American-owned clubs have kind of driven data forward is because that's the world that the owners have come out of. So, like, John Henry, who made his money in like soybean futures, understands data. So he's gone they've bought Liverpool and they've been like, well, let's use the data to make this better, same as they did at the Red Sox and whatever. The reason that all these clubs are going to executive search firms is because that's what they do in other businesses, and to them, football needs to be more of a business. It's part of a broader culture shift, I think.
Yeah, it's football, I'm afraid, is turning into LinkedIn. That's a happy note to end on. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much, Rory. Thank you also to James and producer Tom. We will please remember to leave a comment, leave a review, share us on social media, tell your friends. We will be back at the start of next week. Thanks for listening.